So we're going to play a little bit of a game for a few minutes, and it's going to be sometimes a hard game, but it's a circle of trust, and even though I'm a professor, I'm not going to judge you. So bear with me as we play the game. The game's called the Desert Island Game, and I want you to think of yourselves as the dictator of a new island, and you can decide everything that happens on the island. And I put benevolent in parentheses because try to be nice. So for example, imagine I said, you get to start this new island, and you get to decide how tall everybody is. You can distribute height however you want. You might say, maybe everyone should be the exact same height. That seems nice and fair. Or you might say, well, wouldn't it be more interesting if there were some tall people, and then we'd have basketball, and there were some short people, and then they could have jockeys. Or think about attractiveness. Would everyone be the same level of attractiveness? Would you want some super attractive people, knowing that because they got more attractiveness, there'd be some other people who weren't so attractive? How would you think about that problem of saying who gets what? And what would you be bringing to mind to figure out what's the fair way, what's the right way, what's the way that would make people happy? So that's exactly what we do, but we do it in domains that are maybe a little more consequential than things like height. We do it with things like who should get how much money, or who should get how much health when we think about societies that we construct. And the way that we think about this is we ask people a bunch of questions, and I'm going to ask you to play along as well. What do you think your society looks like right now? Then I'll ask you, Desert Island Game, if you were the dictator, what would you like it to look like? What do you think is the fair or the ideal way? And then we'll compare those to what society actually looks like, and we'll find sometimes we're not so sure really of what we're living in right now. And we'll compare all those to each other. So what you think it is, what you'd like it to be, and what it actually is, and see whether those line up or not. And then the other thing we'll do to see is, and think about even in this room, do people agree or disagree? So if we ask rich people and poor people, do they think the same thing or do they think really differently? Or if we ask conservatives and liberals, do they think the same thing or do they think really differently? We'll find out as we go through some of the data. So let's start with wealth. It's kind of a big topic. Wealth inequality is certainly an issue in the current political climate. And I'm going to give you some questions right now and ask you to try to answer them in your heads. So think about America as everyone, and then divide it into 20%. The richest 20%, the next richest, next, down to the poorest 20%. And come up with a number in your mind right now. For example, what do you think the richest 20% of Americans have in terms of all the wealth? Do the next one, the next one, the next one, the next one, all the way down to what do you think the poorest 20% of Americans have? Keep those numbers in your head. We asked a sample of over 5,000 Americans what they thought from all over different income groups, gender, ethnicity, everyone we could find in the US. We asked them this same question, and here's what they told us. So just to orient you, the blue bar, that's the biggest one, are people's estimates of how much wealth the top 20% of Americans have, and they think they have about 60% of the wealth. Think about what you thought in your head. Probably many of you thought about 60% of the wealth is what the richest 20% had. Then think about the bottom 20%. Americans told us they thought they had not much, 3 to 4% of the wealth. So they really understood that there's a lot of inequality in the United States. This is certainly not an equal distribution. But here's the second question, and this is the benevolent dictator game that I asked you to play. Now answer these questions. If it were up to you, what should the richest 20% of Americans have? The next, all the way down to what should the poorest 20% of Americans. And you can decide whatever you like, whatever you think is the right distribution. I'll show you what Americans told us they thought, and you can compare them to each other. So people thought the ideal distribution was much more equal than what they thought the distribution was. So they thought that the richest 20% should have about 36 to 40%, usually when we ask them. They thought the poorest 20% should have about 10%. What's interesting is people don't say everyone should have the same amount. So we don't have some theory that if everyone had not the same height, not the same amount of wealth. Most people tell us, no, there can be rich people and poor people, but just less extreme than they estimated it to be. And what's most striking, I think, about this chart is now I'm going to show you what reality is. And we're pretty smart people here, and I work at a business school, so I'm supposed to know these things. And I'll tell you that I was surprised by this as well. Here's the actual state of America right now. So what you can see is that the top 20% of Americans, estimates vary, but they have something like 80 to 85% of all the wealth. You might be looking for the purple and the light blue line. The reason they're not there is not because I'm bad at making graphs, although I am bad at making graphs. It's because they have so little that they don't even show up. So the bottom 40% of Americans have about 0.3% of the wealth, something like that. So really drastic differences here. So people think it's more equal than it actually is, and they'd like it in their ideal for it to be even more equal than that. And now you can think, well, maybe that's true, but what about, for example, as I said, rich and poor people? What about Democrats and Republicans? Would they agree on this, or are they all over the place in terms of what they think the ideal is? Well, luckily we have enough people where we can break it down by exactly that. And look, so this is the same actual data that I showed you before, but now what I'm doing is I'm breaking down the data by different attributes. For example, people who make less than 50,000, people who make more than 150,000, Bush voters and Kerry voters. This data is from a few years ago. Remember those people, women and men. What you can see is these are the estimates. Everyone's wrong, and nobody's particularly any better than anybody else. Every group we ask really underestimates the current state of affairs. But you might think that the ideals are where we'd really start to see differences, right? Rich people might say, I really like more inequality. Poor people might say, I'd really like less. Conservatives might say, I'm comfortable with more. Liberals might say, I'm comfortable with less. But I'll show you that what we find is really an amazing consensus when we ask people. There are differences. So it is true that Bush voters are comfortable with a little more inequality than Kerry voters. But no group, their estimate is even close to their ideal. Every group we've surveyed thinks that their ideal is more equal than what they think it is. And again, those are far more equal than it actually is. And to be self-referential for a moment, we can also ask some super educated people who maybe are supposed to know better because they spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on their education. Any idea who I'm referring to? Harvard graduates. So we got the Harvard Alumni magazine to let us survey alumni of the college and the other schools as well. Same questions. What do you think it's like? What would you like it to be? Compare it to actual. Here's what we found. In this case, the actual's on the right, so the purple bar here is what the rich people have. You can see that the estimates of Harvard graduates are no more accurate than anybody else we asked. And their ideals are, again, far more equal than their estimates, which are far more equal than their ideals. The funniest thing was we had enough people where we could break it down by where you graduated from. So we have people who graduated from arts and sciences, all the way up to people who graduated from where I work, the business school. You might think those people are different in terms of how they feel about wealth, and I'll show you that they're not so much. So the very leftmost bar there is graduates of the Harvard Business School, their ideal. And the very rightmost bar is graduates of Harvard Business School, their estimates. So that group, again, their ideals are far more equal than their estimates, and it's true of graduates of every other school as well. Really, everywhere we've looked, we see that people think that the current distribution is more unequal than they would like it to be. So that's wealth, that's the first thing. Let's think about income now. So what if we ask people a different set of questions, and I'll have you play along again as well. Do we have any sense of what the current distribution of income is? And again, what would we like it to be? And here we can ask it in a different way. Rather than what do 20% of people have, we can ask you really, really simple questions like this. How much do you think a chairman of a large national corporation earns? Think of a number in your head. Think in the United States right now. What do you think they earn? How much do you think an unskilled worker in a factory earns? Think of it in your head. Come up with an answer. What we can do, of course, is create a ratio. So we'll have a number that says basically, what do you think that ratio is? Do you think it's 5 to 1? Do you think it's 50 to 1? Do you think it's 100 to 1? And what's particularly interesting is we did this all over the world. So we have data from 40 countries that I'll show you in a second. Now we can look not just within the US, do conservatives and liberals agree or disagree, but how about in 40 countries all over the world, do people agree or disagree about income inequality? Let me show you what people estimated all over the world. To orient you to this figure, around the outside are the 40 countries. Everyone is immediately looking for their country, by the way. It's a fascinating aspect of human psychology because we're such egomaniacs. You can see it's a radius. So in the center it says 1. That would mean that someone said, I think that the richest person and the poorest person in the company make the same amount. And the outer ring says 41. That would mean that someone said, I think the chairman makes 41 times as much as the unskilled factory worker. And here's the data from all over the world. There's a lot of variance on what people are estimating for what people make. You can see the United States, it's about 31 to 1. You can see the biggest outlier here. Australians and South Koreans think it's about 41 to 1. Again, these are their estimates of what it's like. I'll show you, as I did before, the reality in a few minutes. The average across everyone is something like 10 to 1. So people think, if you think about it in US dollars, they think the lowest paid person makes $20,000 and the average chairman makes about $200,000. So they definitely think people don't make the same amount of money. They do think there's a gap, but again, I'll show you what that gap is actually like. But the other thing we do, just like with wealth, is we ask people, what should these people make? Again, desert island, if it were up to you and you had people running the company and people working in the factory, what do you think they should earn? Think about it again in your head. I think the person running it, he or she should make this. I think the person in the factory, he or she should make this. Here's what we find. So we can make the ratio again. Same picture I showed you before. Now in blue, I'll show you people's ideal ratio of CEO pay to the unskilled worker. And what you can see is that in every country in the world, the ratio is more equal than their estimated ratio. Just like with wealth, people seem to have a belief that more equality is more desirable than less. And it's about 5 or 6 to 1 overall across countries. So remember the 20,000, 200,000? What people kind of do is say 30,000, 150,000. They take a little bit from the rich and they give a little bit to the poor. Now, nobody again says equal. People still think there should be rich and poor people. They just think that the gap should be smaller than they think it is. But now let me tell you what it actually is. And to do that, we have to get data from different sources. So I don't have all 40 countries because it's hard to get the data. But I do have many of the countries. Sorry if yours is not on here. I want to point out one thing about this figure that you may have noticed, which is that remember the outer ring before ended at 41? You may notice here it ends at 351. Meaning that there's a country in here where the ratio of CEO pay to the average worker is 351 to 1. Ending the suspense, guess which country it is? It's the United States. But even in these other countries, you can see that the ring of 100 to 1 or 50, these are rings that many countries touch. So now what I want to do is put back on the data. Remember the red and the blue that I showed you before? I'm going to put that back on this graph. You've seen it before, but now, of course, the scale has changed. Here are people's estimates. And look, you might want to lean forward and look really closely. Those are their ideals. So really dramatic underestimation of the current state of affairs, and again, wanting more equality than that. So what does this mean? So this is the dictator game, benevolent dictator on an island, very abstract. What does this mean? Well, think about this. In the Dodd-Frank Act, I'm sure you read the entire act as I did, and you got all the way to Section 953B, right? It turns out that in Section 953B of the Dodd-Frank Act, there's a new rule that requires all public corporations to disclose their pay ratios. They actually have to say, what does the CEO make? They have to say publicly what the median employee makes, and they have to disclose the ratio. Now, because none of us probably read shareholder reports where that information is, the question is, if we have this ideal in our minds of the perfect society, how can we make people understand which companies reflect that ideal or not? And the idea that we had is drawn from these. You know these energy saver labels that are on products? When you buy an air conditioner, you can figure out if it's good for the environment or not. And some of them are like this, and then you can see, oh, wait, this one's really different. Imagine when you bought a product instead of that label, or in addition to that label, it had this label. And you could actually see the ratio of CEO pay to employee pay at this company is 1,000 to 1. This is Walmart, by the way. Or another company might have something like this, where the ratio is 60 to 1. This is Costco. Companies vary really widely on their CEO pay ratios. Would it change your consumer behavior? Would it change who you bought from? And that's what we find in our experiments, actually, that when you learn that there are companies that are closer to your ideal, to your dictator game playing on the island, those are companies that you're more willing to buy from. So to conclude, thinking about You're the Benevolent Dictator, starting very abstractly, many of you probably came up with ideals that were close to what I showed you in those figures. Many of you were probably surprised to learn about the current state of affairs. We're working really hard to get people to think not just this is a game that we play on a desert island, but let's think more carefully about how to bring this to bear on our own societies. Thank you very much.